are finishing up tonight the book of Joel. You go, wow, okay, I'm coming at the end. How fast did you go through that? It's only 3 chapters long, so yes, you're getting in here at the end, but hopefully you'll get the flavor of what God was writing through this prophet named Joel. A quick little review of the book of Joel. There's just 4 things that you probably need to know. Let's look at the whole phrase of what the book of Joel birthed on the scene about 850 BC. It was through the prophet Joel that this phrase, the day of the Lord, came into being. No other prophet or no other period before 850 BC used this terminology. After this time of Joel, 75 other times this phrase, the day of the Lord, will be used in the Bible. Okay? 14 prophets will use this phrase, the day of the Lord. It became so well known that sometimes they shorten it and they would say, in that day. Everybody knew what they were talking about. They were talking about the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord is about the day that's coming of God's judgment and wrath, which we in this generation call that the tribulation is coming. All right? It was foretold in the Bible that far back, 850 years before Jesus' birth. So, here's the 4 things that you missed in chapter 1 and chapter 2. In chapter 1, he's going to give us all the things that are going to come to pass that will be the signs that the day is, Joel uses this term, the day is at hand. Means it's close to happening when you see these things. He says, 1, there's going to be locusts will mark that it's at hand. He says there's going to be fires that will mark in that day. And you say, well, wait a minute, we've always had locusts, we've always had fires. In chapter 1, he uses this terminology. He says, but generations will say to their children and their children's children, no one has seen it at this level. No one can say that they've seen, and our world kind of describes that right now. No one can say that they've seen a whole nation like Australia declare it's on fire. Amazing if you've watched what's been happening there. So many believe that the book of Joel is being fulfilled right before our eyes. There's the attack of these locusts, but he gives them in 4 different types of the locusts. And some of the best scholars, and J. Vernon McGee, I don't know if you liked him on the radio or not, but I've always liked J. Vernon McGee. I just like his name. J. Vernon McGee, and he put a parallel that the 4 locusts could be an allegory of the 4 horsemen because they come in swarms and what they do, and once they've gone through an area, the devastation in that area of the 4 types of locusts that Joel talks about. But Revelation also then connects that there is a literal attack of an army of locusts that are demonic. And the description in Joel tells you that they come like an army, they move like an army, they're obviously under someone's command, and they will bring great devastation, and yet they're able to creep into your window and into your house. Ooh. Now, that description of that demonic locust that deal with the 5th and the 6th trumpet and that. Last week, we saw in chapter 2, as he continues to come back to some of those things that we saw in chapter 1, that he talks about that something that will mark again as the day is at hand is the outpouring of his Spirit. And I love that. You learned last week when it says he will pour out his Spirit upon all flesh, my sons and daughters. And then he goes on, yes, even my servants and my handmaidens will be able to receive the Spirit. That for in all of history, all recorded history, less than 2% of leaders in our world were Christian women leaders. Something happened in the 21st century. That 2%, that means 2 out of 100 leaders, 2 could have been women. Whether they were missionaries, teachers, Christian teachers, or preachers, or whatever. But in the 21st century now, that statistic is 1 out of 5 is a woman in a Christian leadership role. 1 out of 5. Is that the fulfillment that he's pouring it out upon all flesh? My sons and my daughters will prophesy, and my servants and my handmaidens will be poured, the Spirit will be poured out on them. It seems to be, by most scholars, again, they're saying we should be very alert that these things of Joel are coming to pass. Tonight, wow. Where do you see how all the connections? If you've been with us in any time, if you've been with us through the book of Zechariah, if you've been with us through the book of Ezekiel, if you've been with us through the book of Micah, they all intersect with chapter 3 of Joel for us tonight. I'm going to show you how that works. Let's look at the very first 2 verses of Joel chapter 3. In those days and at that time. So it's telling you this is a many day period and then a certain time period. In those days is meaning many days, and at that time, when I what? Restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem. I will gather all the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. There I will put them on trial for what they did to my inheritance, my people Israel, because they scattered my people among the nations and divided up my land. Now, here's how I decided to share with you what just the first 2 verses did in this. This is where you start connecting with the rest of the Bible. Some of the people that God's taken to heaven here, just in the last couple weeks, Van Impe went to heaven. I used to watch him as a young man in the 80s when he would share scriptures and stuff. Here's what, you had your VCR in those days. I used to have to pause it as I'd write down the scriptures because he would tell you how this passage now, and it connects here with this, and it connects here with this, and he would rattle off so many scriptures so quick that I couldn't follow how is that all connected. So I had to videotape him and go, okay, well, I got those 2 in, and then he rattled too many before I could write the other ones down. And I kept going back and getting it. I love that he knew the Word of God like that. He didn't draw me along. I didn't stay as a student of him, learning from him, who knew so much because he was showing his knowledge, but he wasn't allowing us to go on the journey. I want you to go on the journey with this here tonight. He just told you some very important things. He's describing the time period that's going to happen. There's a restoration taking place of Judah and Jerusalem, and it says, I will gather all nations. Who's doing the gathering? That's Jesus the Messiah. And he's going to put on a trial in the valley of Jehoshaphat. So let me take you through some scriptures that talk about this day that's being described here in the beginning of Joel in other places of the Bible. In Zechariah 13:8, some of you have been wondering when I said to you that throughout what happened in history with the Jews in World War II, some believe, I listened to one said they believe that the statistic is more like 1 out of every 2, 50% of the Jews were killed from 1938 to 1945. 1 out of 2 of all the Jews in the world. I've heard more in the scholarly part of it is 1 out of 3. But if you see this scripture here in Zechariah 13:8, this is telling about a day in the whole land, declares the Lord, where 2/3 will be struck down and perish, and yet 1/3 will be left in it. If you read the verses before it, you read the verses after it, you see who he's talking about. He's talking about Israel. When will this happen? In the period that we've just got described that comes up to a trial. It's called the Great Tribulation. In the Old Testament, the Jews know it as the times of Jacob's trouble. The Great Tribulation is a 7-year period. 2 out of 3 Jews will die during that, according to the prophecy of Zechariah, that connects with what's the time? At that time, this is what's going to take place. Okay? And then in Zechariah 14:4, and we went through these, you may not have remembered since it's been some time since we were in Zechariah. On that day, or as Joel is saying, at that time, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives east of Jerusalem, and the Mount of Olives will be split into 2 from east to west, forming a great valley. That's what I wanted you to catch from Zechariah here, with half of the mountain moving north and half of the mountain south. No Christian geologists can tell you where the Valley of Jehoshaphat is at. Some of them speculate this and speculate that. Eschatology, those that study end times are telling you the valley's not been created yet. The valley of Jehoshaphat is when Jesus comes down and he splits what Zechariah is saying, and he puts one foot on one mountain and the other, and he creates this valley in here. This is where he's going to hold this trial, right here. So you're seeing how the Bible connects in with what we're learning in Joel here tonight. Now, Matthew chapter 25, verses 31 through 46. If you were here on Sunday morning just a couple weeks ago, I finished preaching through the parables of Matthew. In Matthew 25, verses 31 through 46, it's the parable of the sheep and the goats. The parable tells you what the time period is. Jesus starts out, he says, when I come back with my angels, I will do exactly what Joel says here in verse 2. I will gather all the nations, and I will put the sheep on my one side and the goats on the other. And I'm going to make a judgment, a trial right there. What Jesus gives as a parable, he is quoting from here in Joel, chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. Now, the trial is based on how his people were treated during that time period that's in the future. He says, Jesus gives us that clue, especially in the parable. Many Christians get this wrong. If you were here on that Sunday morning, I told you it's the most wrongly interpreted parable. Today, many of our Christian universities try to make it as another way of getting into heaven, as you've done it unto the least of these. So they say you have to become like a social worker if you're a Christian. You better feed the people that you see that are hungry. You better clothe them that you see that need clothed. You better go visit them in prison and do all these different things. But Jesus wasn't developing a social gospel. He was telling you in that parable, when I return with my angels and I come, I'm going to judge the nations. He's referring to this time period, the future. And he says, as you've done it unto the least of these, my people, my brothers and my sisters. Not everybody that's in need is a brother and sister of Jesus. Should we, in the broader sense, be good to people that are in need? Absolutely. But is that what Jesus' parable was here? No, it's a connection back to the prophet Joel. Now, I didn't even go through that on that Sunday morning. Only you that come to Coffee House get that connection. I so wanted to say, I think I did say it if you go back and say, boy, Joel is going to give you some of this. You don't want to miss how this is going to intersect. Why? Because we know the Bible is a divine integrated message system. You pull on one portion of the scripture, it's tugging somewhere else. God showing that he knows, as he says in Isaiah, I know the end from the beginning. All right, so here's the connection here. So the trial is based on how his people were being treated during the Great Tribulation. This is setting up what? The millennial reign of Christ for 1,000 years. There are 3 judgments in the Bible. Most people only know the great white throne judgment. That's the last. The first one happens right after the rapture. It's where the rewards are given out to the Christians at that time. If your works are good, you'll get rewards. It says your works will be like jewels that they make it. But if you just made it by the skin of your teeth because you were believing the bridegroom was coming for you and you got there and you didn't have any things that you showed that you were walking as a kingdom person, making a difference, then you still made it to heaven, but your works are burned up like chaff or straw is burned up. That's the description of the Bema Seat judgment. The next judgment is the one we're in tonight in Joel chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. What it is the sheep and goat judgment of Jesus' parable. Or, as Joel says it, the trial is on. You know, way back when, I had no idea when we as America would be seeing a trial of our president, but the trial is on here for certain people. And let's see how this trial unfolds here tonight. Let's go through verses 3 through 8 as he judges the nations. Now listen, this tells you some of the terrible things that are going to happen during the tribulation. They cast lots for my people. They trade boys for prostitution. They sold girls for wine to drink. Now, what have you against me, Tyre and Sidon, and all you regions of Philistia? Are you repaying me for something I have done? If you are paying me back, I will swiftly and speedily return on your own heads what you have done. For you took my silver, my gold. Notice that in the scripture up there, I have the word my dark in there. My gold, and carried off my finest treasures to your temples. You sold the people of Judah and Jerusalem to the Greeks, that you might send them far from their homeland. See, I'm going to roust them out of the places to which you sold them, and I will return on your own heads what you have done. I will sell your sons and daughters to the people of Judah, and they will sell them to the Sabeans, a nation far away. The Lord has spoken. Wow. He took them down just a little bit of a history. Remember, this is 850 BC. He's proclaiming some things that are going to happen out there. He's actually bringing in things of Tyre and Sidon and different cities. And how's all that tie in together? Let me show you what just took place in those verses here. Israel and the nations. This is something that most Christians aren't taught today, like what I was taught when I was growing up, how important the nation of Israel is. Some actually use what they call a replacement theology. Because, when Israel was dispersed in 70 AD, there was no nation of Israel till 1948. So many people that were teaching the Bible came up with a replacement theology and said, you and I, the church, have replaced Israel. That's not what took place. God has a special place for Israel, and you see that here in the book of Joel. It's so powerful in this way. Number one, God doesn't view Israel as a part of the nations of the world. They are set apart. They have been from the time of Abraham. They're not included when he says, and the nations will be judged. That's not Israel. Israel has its own judgment. Their judgment, what most people don't realize, their biggest judgment is the tribulation itself. For rejecting Jesus as the Messiah, they're going to go through this terrible 7 years that has been set aside especially for the nation Israel. Those that don't understand that Jesus is coming for his bride and don't go in the rapture, they'll have to go through it too, and the world will go through that time period. But that time period is especially for Israel. Number two, Tyre and Sidon are part of modern-day Lebanon. Israel's burden is with their enemies, the Philistines. I could include that in that statement here. Stem back to their disobedience to rid the land of these people. Israel didn't always obey God and take care of the enemy the way God told them to. And so these things have come back to haunt them. He gives the prediction here that Tyre and Sidon will be taken care of, and he actually says Greece, which is what historically will happen in about 325 BC. This is 850 BC. In 325, who's roaming and conquering the world in the fastest way? Alexander the Great. And Alexander is the one that finally is able to conquer the city of Tyre and Sidon. He's the one that conquers them, even though they thought they were impregnable with the island that they had out there. And we studied all that in the book of Ezekiel. So it's kind of a tie-in to that book also. So in this judgment of the nations, God identifies, number three, so strongly with Israel, he says this, and I told you, you saw the word my 3 times, to what the enemies took. If you notice what he said there, he said, it's my gold. It's my sons and daughters. It's my treasure, not Israel's. God is identifying that it's his. And so that's so important that you see when he identifies, just as Jesus identifies with the church as his bride, the Father identifies with Israel as his bride. Now, his bride's been a bad one. That's why you have the book of Hosea. Israel's like a harlot, he says. He's like an adulterous woman. The nation of Israel has not been good towards God the Father in all of its behavior. But the Father says it's his bride. Wow. So the Father has a bride in Israel, and the Son has a bride in the church, which really we're identified as the age of the Gentiles. Now, are there Jews within the bride of Jesus? Absolutely. We started out as a Jewish church. It was Jews that were being saved but very quickly it became a Gentile church as the Jews rejected Jesus as the Messiah. And so the age of the Gentile was birthed, and the church was birthed in that way. All right. Verses 4 through 8 establishes vengeance belongs to God. That's what he's saying. In this trial, in the separation of the sheep and the goats, what's going to take place here, that vengeance belongs to God, not to Israel. It was his vengeance that he's bringing here. Now, Zechariah 2:8 gives a really important part of this. And since I used Zechariah earlier in this, I wanted to tie it back in. As we went through the book of Zechariah, if you didn't catch it, God again was saying how special Israel is, that it stands set apart from the other nations. And he uses this phrase, Israel is the apple of his eye. Do you see why? When he says to Abraham, way back here in the Abraham covenant, those that bless you will be blessed. Because Israel is going to be is the apple of his eye. He sees what they're going to become is the apple of his eye. And those that curse you will be cursed. The reason why the United States of America has prospered is because of the stance that we have taken with Israel. Because in the midst of our decisions in the 20th century and the 21st century, as Israel was being rebirthed, as the dry bones were living again, what Ezekiel taught us, and they came into a nation in 1948, we became more and more pagan, that we would help leading the world in what Jesus said would be signs of that day being at hand. When the Son of Man comes back, it'll be like Sodom and Gomorrah. 2015. United States. The White House put the colors up there that it was now legal to marry between a man and a woman and a woman. Fulfilling that prophecy that Jesus gave. Amazing stuff. So Zechariah gives you the clue. He's the apple. Who is? Israel is the he of God's eye. Wow. And the reason why I said it the way I said that for a purpose so that you would remember. His name was changed from Jacob the deceiver to Israel, who's going to have the 12 sons. His name is actually Israel. His 12 sons would be the 12 tribes. So it's a very personal part, not just a corporate nation part. This is God getting down into family relationships here, and a special relationship with Jacob. Is that why whenever they prayed, I pray to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? All right, you're connecting the dots. Let's look at verses 9 through 16 right here. Proclaim this among the nations. Prepare for war. Rouse the warriors. Let all the fighting men draw near and attack. Beat your plowshares into swords and your pruning hooks into spears. Let the weakling say, I am strong. Come quickly, all you nations from every side, and assemble there. Bring down your warriors, Lord. Let the nations be roused. Let them be advanced into the valley of Jehoshaphat. So it tells you the time period. Jesus is back with his warriors. For there I will sit, he tells you a second time, to judge all the nations on every side. Swing the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Come and trample the grapes, for the winepress is full, and the vats overflow, so great in their wickedness. Wow. Listen to this phrase here. It's interpreted wrong so many times. Multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision. For the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. The sun and the moon will be darkened. Have you heard that somewhere else? And the stars no longer shine. The Lord will roar from Zion and thunder from Jerusalem, and the earth and the heavens will tremble. But the Lord will be a refuge for his people, a stronghold for the people of Israel. This is describing that final battle. Many think it's the battle of Armageddon. It could possibly, that could be it, as they're gathered around to destroy Israel. Remember what you learned here tonight in Zechariah. You learned where now, it's in your notes there, that 2 out of 3 Jews will be killed. All 144,000 of his witnesses, the Jewish witnesses, are martyred. This is why the parable of what he comes back here again in verse 15 as we go through this, the battle of this. First, Micah, he tells them to beat their plows into weapons. Micah says the opposite. Micah's describing now once they get into the millennial, Micah says the complete opposite. This is not a peacetime in Joel. This is the time for war. Jesus is back with his angels. He's going to defeat and destroy all that he can of wickedness. People will still have a free will as they go into millennial, but here they're told to make the weapons out of their agricultural tools. Micah says as they go into millennial, they'll do just the opposite. They'll take their weapons and make them back into agricultural tools. All right, so you're seeing the time periods are here and how it ties in with some of the other things that we've studied. In verses 11 and 12, again a reference to the sheep and goat judgment of the nations of Matthew chapter 25, verses 31 through 46. That he's coming to judge the nations. That's what he gives in that parable. The valley of decision isn't what most of you think about. I've heard preachers when I was growing up preach on this, that talking about us out here, we're in the valley of decision. Can it be applied that way? In a broad sense, absolutely. But when you put it at the time period, this is not a decision of believers. This is the Lord rendering judgment. Rendering the judgment between the sheep and the goats among the nations here. It's his decision who goes into the millennium with him. Who goes into that millennium with Jesus? That's the valley of decision right there when he's back and he splits the mountains there and he creates the valley of Jehoshaphat. So you got to put it in perspective. The multitudes there, it's the whole, what's the population of the world is coming to be judged, all the nations, separate from the white throne judgment that's going to happen at the end of the 1,000 years. Okay? Verse 15 is a repeat of Jesus in Matthew 24:29 and Revelation 6:12 through 13. So look at verse 15 since I tell you that. And what's going on? The sun and the moon will be darkened and the stars will no longer shine. Jesus gives that as one of the signs of his coming. Revelation says this is going to take place. When you see it in Revelation, realize where it's at. The 4 horsemen have already been appeared. In Joel, the 4 waves of these locusts have already come. Is there a parallel between the two? Most scholars say yes here. So you're seeing the connection of this tiny little prophet. When we say a minor prophet, it doesn't mean what he has to talk about is minor. Just means he has less volume than the major prophets like Isaiah and Ezekiel and Jeremiah. Okay? So then he gives this, the Lord will roar. I love this. Amos is going to write about 50 to 60 years in the future. Around, this is 850 or so BC. Amos is going to write about 790 BC, and he's going to come back to this same portion of that he will use, almost like he's quoting Joel, that the Lord will roar. But Revelations 5:5 says that roar is because he's the Lion of Judah. So I thought that's really interesting that he's telling you. I hear so many people go, oh, we're just waiting for Jesus to come back, like he's coming like the lamb that he came the first time. No, he's coming back as a warrior. He's coming back as the Lion of Judah. And he says he's coming back with a roar. If you remember when we went through Isaiah, it says that he's coming back and it's like his robe has been dipped in the winepress, that it's just covered. Well, Revelation tells you, as you get to Revelation 19, it says that when he comes back, that his robe has been dipped in blood. It's the blood of the enemies. It's the vengeance of God that we're seeing in this battle in Joel. I'm trying to connect all the dots for you. Not going too fast, right? Amazing scene right here. Just, wow. Powerful, powerful. So the Lord is the one doing the roaring, and it's because he's the Lion of Judah. The earth, it says here, will tremble, is a major earthquake that is described by Jesus and described also in Revelation. That the earth trembling is not just, it's shaking over what's taking place, that this is a major earthquake that has never been felt before. He's changing the world as he comes back because he's setting up his reign from earth. All right. What the Jews, why they rejected Jesus was because they saw these things and they didn't distinguish between his first coming and his second. They said, this suffering servant that is a shepherd to the people and everything, where's the one that's going to overthrow Rome? That's why the Jews are blind to Jesus. They saw this warrior description of a Messiah. That's what they're looking for. That's why they will accept the Antichrist. He will have a warrior mantle. He will bring those different things, and he'll bring the peace treaty. Many take it wrong. They think it's a peace treaty just between the world and Israel. No, if you read Daniel correctly, it's a peace treaty that he brings to the nations. Israel's one of the nations in that peace treaty for the 7 years. But it's a peace treaty with many nations. It's probably all the nations of the Gog and Magog war that came against Israel. Okay, that he'll barter a 7-year peace treaty where he breaks his own peace treaty in the middle of it and reveals himself as the false Antichrist because he'll set up his image in the temple. Let's look at the very end of this because it moves into, again, the future from what you've just learned about. He's coming back with his angels. There'll be a battle. At the end of that battle, the parable of the sheep and the goats, he's going to make a trial and he's going to judge. Then he's moving into the millennial reign. Keep that in mind as you jump into verse 17 right here. Then you will know that I, the Lord your God, dwell in Zion, my holy hill. Jerusalem will be holy. Never again will foreigners invade her. Some people call this an allegory. None of this has come to pass at all. Israel is always being invaded by foreigners, by foreign missiles and everything to this day. This is futuristic still. This is the millennial reign that when Christ is here. In that day, how interesting, he's the first to shorten it. Many will call it the day of the Lord, just like that's what his whole book is about. But many, especially in the New Testament, will use this phrase, in that day, talking about Christ reigning on earth. In that day, the mountains will drip new wine, and the hills will flow with milk. All the ravines of Judah will run with water. Now, we were not that long ago in Ezekiel. Listen to this language here. A fountain will flow from the Lord's house and will water the valley of Acacia. But Egypt will be desolate. Edom will be a desert waste because of violence done to the people of Judah, in whose land they shed innocent blood. Judah will be inhabited forever, and Jerusalem through all generations. Shall I leave their innocent blood unavenged? No, I will not. The Lord dwells in Zion. Here's what you need to, he connects the dots here, Jesus does here with what he's going to do through the Holy Spirit and the prophet Joel Jerusalem will be the capital of the world. Zechariah 12:10 told us that. As a matter of fact, Ezekiel told us this, that when he comes back, Jerusalem will be different than before. There will be another king reigning from Jerusalem. King David will rule Jerusalem. Jesus rules the world from Jerusalem. That blows your mind when you read that in Ezekiel. That's what we learned in Ezekiel in that. Number 2, the holy city only because Jesus will reign from it. It's not holy because it's, the Jews to this day call it the eternal city because of the promise. Guess what? They're correct in that aspect. God has such a relationship with Israel that when the 1,000 years is done, Satan's loose for a short time, and then we move into the great white throne judgment. He starts off after the great white throne judgment with a brand new heaven, a brand new earth, and a brand new Jerusalem that you and I can't even fathom. We've talked about it many different times. This is not that Jerusalem. This is the Jerusalem for the 1,000-year reign, where David is king over Israel, and Jesus is king over the world. All right, so David comes back to rule with Jesus according to Ezekiel, if you remember those chapters in that. Verse 19 says something about Egypt and something about Edom. What you learned through Ezekiel chapter 29, during the 1,000-year reign, as they go into it, Egypt will be desolate for 40 years because of what they did during the tribulation. Edom will be desolate for the whole 1,000 years. Wow. Ezekiel 29, 8 through 14, if you couldn't remember that it said that, there's where that tie-in is. Verse 18, when it said the river, this river that will flows from the temple, the house of God. That's the house of God, and could be the river of life. Many scholars that I look at it give these two scriptures, Ezekiel 47, 1 through 12, where it talks about in that 1,000-year reign under the temple, there will be a river that goes all the way to the Mediterranean and all the way to the Dead Sea, and the Dead Sea comes back to life. Do you know that just a couple of weeks ago, they've had so much rain at the end of 2019, the beginning of 2020 there in Jerusalem, that a river formed flowing from Jerusalem to the Dead Sea? And the rabbis who know these scriptures, they said, is this the precursor? Is this the beginning? Fresh water is going to a Dead Sea. That they even said in the pools around the Dead Sea, they had signs of life. Nothing can live in the Dead Sea, but the pools around it because of the fresh water. Is it a precursor that our Messiah is coming? That's the Jews that don't know Jesus as the Messiah. They're looking for the Messiah, and the things that are happening right now, that's one of the things that they see that took place at the end of 2019. Pretty powerful. There's the scripture there. So number 5 in closing, the judgment entering the millennial is to establish peace during Jesus' reign. That's why the trial. He's not coming back with all these bad people on the earth and just letting them. Some will scatter is what we're told, because the evil is still in the world. There won't be a devil. He'll be put and locked away for 1,000 years. But you still have a free will. Those that are being born can raise up and rebel against God, even with God living here on the earth, just like Adam and Eve rebelled against God in paradise. Ezekiel tells us that the land will become like paradise. Doesn't mean it's going to be exactly like the paradise of the Garden of Eden, but it'll be like it in many ways. And yet you can still rebel. You can go against God. And that evil will be hidden in the corners, because when Satan is loose, he goes to the four corners of the world, which is an allegory of that they're tucked away, afraid of Jesus' reign, but they'll come out of the four corners in that day that Satan's loose before we're ushered into the great white throne judgment. That's the book of Joel. If you didn't catch it, the book of Joel is probably as crucial of a book for you knowing the sequence of what's coming in the immediate future of the day of the rapture. In that day, what will we be seeing? Fires, the locusts like crazy, all the different reports out there. Some think they're being fulfilled as we're living. And you will see the things of what Jesus said would come before that day. He ties into Joel better than anybody else with what he does in Matthew 24 and with the parable in Matthew 25, the sheep and the goats. Wow. Let me pray. Father, I've done the best to present this book so that we could be people that know your word and know the season. And now, Lord, what do we do with this? How do we equip our world, our sons and our daughters, our own families to be prepared for the season that we could be living in and that the trumpet could sound at any moment? Give us that insight. And for those that are watching online, Lord, I pray that they would realize God doesn't hide his plans. He's only coming as a thief to those that don't know him. But we that know him and love him, we're looking for the bridegroom all the time. May that revelation knowledge cause people to seek out how to have a personal relationship with our Jesus, known as Yeshua, Yahweh in the Old Testament. He is the Christ, the Messiah. And we give you the praise, for the bridegroom is coming someday soon. Amen.